wasn't searching for buried secrets when I started researching frontier Iowa. I was looking at settlement patterns, pioneer architecture, the usual historical material about westward expansion. But then I found a newspaper clipping from 1856, brief, matter-of-fact, almost mundane in its description of something that should have stopped the entire territory in its tracks. Workmen excavating a foundation for a government building had broken through the prairie soil and discovered something impossible. Not an artifact, not a relic, but an engineered structure containing human remains that defied every assumption about who had been there first. The article appeared once, just once, and then nothing. No follow-up, no investigation, no scientific examination. Just silence spreading like a burial shroud over evidence that should have rewritten North American history. The discovery happened on the corner of Main and Valley Streets in what would become downtown Iowa. Governor Grimes needed a new building. The order was straightforward enough. Dig a foundation, prepare the site, get ready for construction. Standard frontier work. But when the crews broke through the topsoil and started excavating deeper, their tools struck something that shouldn't have existed beneath virgin prairie. They'd hit a structure, not a natural formation, not bedrock, but built architecture. An arched vault measuring roughly 10 feet square, constructed with walls 14 inches thick. Walls made from some kind of cement or mortar that the workers couldn't break with their frontier tools. Indestructible, they called it in their reports, a binding material harder than anything they'd seen, more permanent than anything being built in 1856 Iowa. But the vault itself wasn't the discovery that should have changed everything. It was what lay inside. 8 complete human skeletons, not scattered bones from some forgotten burial, not fragmentary remains requiring academic speculation. Complete skeletal structures, preserved in remarkable condition, arranged with obvious care and intention, and every single one measured between 8 and 10 feet in length. The newspaper described them clinically, almost carefully, as if the reporter knew these measurements would be questioned. The largest remains ever found, the account stated. No sensationalism, no frontier tall tales, just documentation of physical evidence that multiple witnesses had examined and measured. Think about what that means. This wasn't a lone giant, some genetic anomaly that could be explained away by medical conditions we recognize today. This was 8 individuals of extraordinary size, buried together in a deliberately constructed chamber beneath land that official history claims was uninhabited by any advanced civilization. The vault's very existence posed questions that conventional archaeology has never adequately addressed. Who possessed the engineering knowledge to build permanent architecture with arched ceilings in pre-European Iowa? Who had access to binding materials superior to anything frontier settlers were using? Who built fortress-thick walls to protect remains they clearly valued enough to preserve for what must have been centuries? The construction details matter more than you might think. Arch building isn't a technique you stumble upon accidentally. It requires understanding force distribution, load-bearing capacity, precise measurement. It requires mathematical knowledge and engineering experience. The 14-inch walls weren't decorative excess. That's the kind of thickness you build when you're protecting contents from enormous pressure, from the weight of earth above, from the erosion of time itself. This was architecture designed for permanence, built by people who understood materials and construction in ways that shouldn't have existed in the Iowa Territory timeline we've been taught. And the preservation worked. The newspaper account specifically notes that the remains were in a good state of preservation. The vault had succeeded in its purpose. Whatever civilization built that chamber understood exactly what they were doing. They weren't primitive people hoping their burial methods might work. They were accomplished engineers creating a structure that functioned as designed across centuries, possibly millennia. The bodies were protected from decay, from moisture, from the elements. The chamber held. The engineering proved itself effective in ways that make the subsequent dismissal of this discovery all the more suspicious. Because here's where the story takes its strangest turn. After that initial newspaper report, The discovery simply vanished from the historical record. No scientific expeditions arrived from Eastern universities. No Smithsonian representatives came to collect and study the remains. No follow-up articles appeared detailing what happened to 8 giant skeletons that should have revolutionized understanding of North American prehistory. The vault was presumably filled back in. Governor Grimes got his building. The skeletons disappeared into whatever fate awaits evidence that contradicts accepted narratives too directly. Within weeks, it was as if the discovery had never happened. You might argue this was simple frontier practicality. Iowa in 1856 had no established museums, no archaeological institutions prepared to house and study such finds. The territory had more pressing concerns than ancient remains, no matter how unusual. But that explanation collapses when you consider what didn't happen next. The discovery wasn't reported to scientific societies in the East. No detailed measurements were preserved. No photographs were taken once that technology became widely available. No excavation teams returned in later decades when Iowa had developed the infrastructure to properly investigate. The decision about what to preserve and what to bury seemed to follow a very specific pattern. Evidence that challenged the accepted timeline most directly was the evidence that disappeared fastest. And the Iowa vault wasn't isolated. That's perhaps the most troubling aspect of this entire investigation. Throughout the 1800s, similar discoveries kept appearing in local newspapers across America, then vanishing from official records with suspicious regularity. Wisconsin, 1891. Burial mounds opened to reveal skeletons of unusual size. Sent to Washington for study. Never displayed, never mentioned in publications again. Ohio, multiple accounts throughout the 1800s describing ancient mounds containing remains measuring 7 to 9 feet in length, often accompanied by sophisticated artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgy and cultural practices. Most of these finds disappeared within months of discovery. Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. The pattern repeats across the frontier and beyond. Local newspapers document the discoveries. Brief articles, usually matter-of-fact in tone. Then, silence. The remains vanish. The sites are destroyed by farming or development. The evidence disappears before systematic study can occur. Map these discoveries and something disturbing emerges. They cluster along river valleys, near major waterways, in patterns suggesting widespread population rather than scattered anomalies. They appear in engineered structures, not simple graves. They show evidence of construction techniques and burial practices that don't match any recognized indigenous tradition from the accepted timeline. The conventional explanation requires us to believe that hundreds of independent witnesses across multiple states over decades all made the same mistakes. All misidentified animal bones as human remains. All exaggerated measurements in identical ways. All participated in an elaborate deception or suffered from frontier ignorance that somehow produced remarkably consistent descriptions of architectural features and skeletal dimensions. What happened to the Iowa giants and to hundreds of similar discoveries wasn't accidental neglect. It was systematic suppression, not through dramatic conspiracy, but through institutional gatekeeping. Through the quiet decisions of museums and universities about which evidence deserved study and which evidence could be safely ignored. When major institutions were building collections throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, they operated within a very specific narrative framework about American prehistory. Indigenous peoples arrived via the Bering Land Bridge relatively recently. They developed in isolation from Old World civilizations. They built nothing permanent, nothing monumental before European contact. Any discovery challenging this narrative created problems. Giant skeletons suggested different populations, different timelines, different stories entirely. So those discoveries were archived in ways that made them difficult to access, stored in facilities where they wouldn't be displayed, or simply lost in vast collections where they could be forgotten. This wasn't active destruction of evidence. It was passive erasure, the kind that happens when institutions decide certain questions aren't worth asking. certain evidence isn't worth preserving. Certain chapters of history aren't worth telling. And it worked. Within a generation, discoveries that had been documented in newspapers, witnessed by multiple credible observers, and reported with specific measurements had been relegated to frontier folklore, dismissed as exaggeration, misidentification, or outright hoax without the forensic examination such dismissals should require. Consider what the Iowa discovery actually demonstrated, independent of later explanations designed to make it disappear. Sophisticated construction methods indicating advanced engineering knowledge, permanent architecture suggesting cultural complexity and social organization, burial practices demonstrating reverence for the dead and belief in preservation across time, and human remains of a size that doesn't fit anywhere in conventional models of North American prehistory. The vault's arch design alone requires understanding of force distribution that shouldn't exist in the official timeline. The 14-inch walls suggest extensive experience with load-bearing construction. The indestructible mortar indicates knowledge of material science far beyond what we attribute to any culture supposedly present in pre-European Iowa. The skeletons themselves present equally troubling evidence for accepted chronologies. If the measurements documented in that 1856 newspaper were accurate, we're looking at a population averaging 8 to 10 feet in height. Not individuals with gigantism, which produces characteristic skeletal deformities, but multiple individuals of exceptional size, buried together with clear cultural intention, preserved in conditions suggesting the vault builders understood exactly how to protect remains across centuries. This wasn't a random burial. This was engineered preservation, executed by people with resources, knowledge, and motivation to construct permanent memorial architecture for their dead. And that brings us to questions no official archive, no textbook, no conventional history has answered satisfactorily. What happened to those 8 skeletons? Were they reburied when construction continued? Were they taken to some private collection where they remain undocumented? Were they deliberately destroyed because they contradicted narratives too fundamental to challenge? We don't know, because no one in a position of institutional authority chose to create clear records. Why was sophisticated burial architecture constructed beneath Iowa prairie? Who possessed the engineering knowledge to build with arched ceilings and superior binding materials? Why were 8 individuals of gigantic proportions buried together with such obvious care and permanence? These aren't rhetorical questions meant to provoke speculation. They're evidence gaps that conventional archaeology has never adequately addressed, choosing instead to dismiss the entire category of giant discoveries rather than engage with specific evidence each case presents. When you examine the Iowa vault alongside hundreds of similar finds from the 1800s, a disturbing possibility becomes harder to ignore. What if North America was inhabited by populations we no longer acknowledge? What if those populations built permanent structures, developed advanced construction techniques, achieved levels of cultural sophistication that don't appear in our accepted timeline? What if the burial mounds scattered across the Midwest aren't simple graves, but the last visible remnants of architectural complexes systematically dismantled and erased by European expansion? The evidence exists, but it exists in fragments. Newspaper accounts never followed up, museum collections never properly catalogued, discoveries buried again before systematic study could occur. It exists in gaps and silences, in questions institutional archaeology chose not to ask. The workmen who found the Iowa vault in 1856 faced practical realities. Governor Grimes needed his building. The frontier economy didn't allow for archaeological delays, and in 1856 there was no framework for understanding what they'd found, no institutions ready to preserve it, no narrative that could accommodate it. But what's harder to explain is why later generations didn't return to investigate. Why no archaeological team in the 1900s excavated the site searching for remaining evidence? Why the discovery remained a footnote rather than becoming a catalyst for deeper questions about Iowa's prehistory? Maybe the answer is uncomfortable. If the Iowa giants were real, If the measurements were accurate, if the vault demonstrated engineering that predates accepted timelines, then the entire story of North American prehistory begins to collapse. And sometimes it's easier to preserve simple narratives than acknowledge evidence demanding we completely rewrite our understanding of the past. For one brief moment in 1856, the earth beneath Iowa opened just enough to reveal it. 8 skeletons of gigantic proportions preserved in architecture that shouldn't exist, built by hands we can no longer identify. But instead of studying it, they covered it again, filled it, built over it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Iowa was home to a civilization of giants, then the real question isn't what was discovered in 1856. It's what else lies beneath the farmlands of America, waiting to contradict everything we think we know about who walked this continent before us.